happy to have you guys amongst us during this debate. It is more than a pleasure for us to host this debate session as we model the WSDC. Today's motion is adopted from the 2018 Croatia-Slovenia WSDC motion, which believes that this House believes that the democratic states should not own or run media organizations. On team proposition, we have Ayman, Alia, and Basma, and on team proposition opposition, we have Carla, Naya, Ibrahim, and I'm sorry, I couldn't read this name. The last one.
It's Elma.
Alma.
There's Elma and Yasemin.
Alma and Yasemin. Perfect. So, Mr. Ayman, you get to go first as the first speaker of team proposition. You have 8 minutes speaking time. And you can go in 3, 2, 1.
Freedom of the press is not just important to democracy, it is democracy. This quote, said by Walter Cronkite, an American broadcast journalist, encapsulates our world, the proposition's world. A world where everybody benefits of the freedom of speech and where journalists benefit of the freedom of press. Now, as a comparative, I will describe the opposition's world. Journalists are long faced with attacks, both physical and legal, for their reporting work. Also, government ownership is generally associated with less press freedom, fewer political and economic rights. As you can see, in the opposition's world, the problems are endless, but there is a way to drastically change the situation, which we proposition will show you. Now, there are different important terms we need to characterize in these debates.
POI.
Media organization, no thank you. Media organization, a person or entity engaged in disseminating information to the general public through a newspaper, magazine, or other publication. Democratic states, the people have the right to choose the government officials, and people have the power. Own means that something belongs to someone, and run means to be in charge of. Now, considering that this debate is about whether the government should or should not run or own media organization, proposition says no. Government should not run or own media organization. And our mechanism is that media organization would be privately owned. So then the opposition might say, what? I didn't hear.
POI.
Yes.
I think your team mischaracterized the debate. We're not eliminating all private media institutions. We're just saying that maybe 1 or 2 state-owned media would be in place.
Please, can you repeat your question? Can you rephrase your observation in a question?
Sure. I think the motion is not about all media organizations being state-owned. It's just about maybe a number of them, but we will keep private media organizations.
Yes, we'll keep media organization, but those media organizations should not be run or owned by the government, because there are many consequences after this. Now, you're probably going to tell yourself why the government should not run a media organization. So in today's debate, we proposition are going to address the main arguments. Argument 1, allowing democratic states to own media can possibly push a political agenda. Argument 2, media organization owned by democratic states could jeopardize important news becoming accessible to everyone. And argument 3, the argument 3 concerns, well, I think I will let those arguments to my second speaker, and I will start by talking about my first argument. So my first argument is that allowing democratic state to own media can possibly push a political agenda. And the reason is by letting democratic states own media organization, we are altering the truth. In perhaps the most concerning development of recent years, press freedom has come under unusual pressure in the United States, and which is the world, no, thank you, and the world leading democratic power. And although key news organizations remain strong and continue to produce vigorous reporting on those in office, the President Donald Trump's continual vilification of the press has seriously exacerbated an ongoing erosion of public confidence in the mainstream media. It is also easier to spread misinformation on social media than to correct it, and easier to inflame social divisions than to mend them. Now I'll move to my second argument. Media organizations, yes?
Okay, so since you actually mentioned in your characterization that democracy is based on people and also private sectors are based on people, how come that in the public sector of media we are altering the truth?
Well, because we all know that each state has its own interests, and that the state might go through altering the truth in order to have its own needs. And I think we have enough example to illustrate it. So that's a generality. And so moving to my second argument, media organization owned by democratic states could possibly target primarily black zip codes, and that media organizations owned by democratic states could jeopardize important news becoming accessible to everyone. And so the media organization owned by democratic states could possibly target primarily black zip codes and restrict them from accessing vote dates. In 2019, to be Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg announced Facebook's new policy to allow politicians the right to post false information, which was later discovered to be the Republican Party's attempt at pushing their political agendas. And the Congress heavily dismantled this policy, rightfully claiming that it could possibly target minorities and African American communities from accessing important dates or information. And so to rephrase or to go back to my arguments, the first one was about allowing democracy that the first consequence will be to push political agenda, which we don't want. And the second one is that it can jeopardize important news becoming accessible to everyone. And to conclude, I can say that I am very proud to support the proposition, and yes, that's it.
Thank you, Mr. Ayman, for your speech. We are now moving to team opposition with their first speaker. Could you please turn on your camera? Thank you.
Let me just set this.
Cool. Mr. Ibrahim. Okay, Mr. Ibrahim. Well, you have 8 minutes speaking time. That's gonna start in 3, 2, 1. Thank you.
From beginning of today's debate, we think that the truth is lacking because of the rapid increase of propaganda by private media. We think that the people are forced to see things that they are not guaranteed without no alternative that they can trust. Yes, we understand free speech and we will keep these private institutions working, but we support a number of state-owned media like it's happening in Canada and Australia. What am I going to do in this speech? Two things. Firstly, refutation and framework to their case, but secondly, my argument in which I will talk about the urgency of state-owned media and the justifications of placing them. So firstly, on refutation and framework, we think that firstly, they push on us a very extreme case in which they attack journalists, etc., like it's happening in China or in an authoritarian country. We think that we do not support these authoritarian regimes or authoritarian approaches. We support that one state-owned media or two. Panel, notice that we will keep these private institutions working, like a CNN or like Fox News. We will actually keep them, and i.e. they will not be harmed, and i.e. most of their whole analysis falls off if there are any. So secondly, we tell you what are these states exactly, what are these democratic states? Because we think that there's a mischaracterizations on what are these democratic states from their side of the house. We think that these are states where people are elected, where people elected their heads of government or their heads of states, like the United States of America or like Canada. But secondly, that there is free speech and you can say whatever you want without being punished. So that's the definition of a democratic state. But thirdly, we tell you that our burden in today's debate and proposition burden, since they did not push any burden on us, is to minimize the propaganda. On their side of the house, they have to minimize the propaganda, or they have to at least acknowledge that there is no propaganda. On our side of the house, we will prove to you that there is, that we can minimize the propaganda. But firstly, we think that there is a contemporary question in today's debate, and that is to say, will the state media lie exactly, and when? We think that there is no incentive for the state media to lie because they can actually risk their elections, and they can actually risk being elected in the next election. We think that there is a high risk of getting not elected in the next, maybe in next year or the next election. But then they pushed on us the idea that they will alter the truth and that these states are actually, they will push a political agenda. So we have three responses to this. Firstly, they will not alter the truth for the reason I just mentioned, that they would risk elections in the first place. But secondly, we tell that even if they would be pushing political agenda, we think that political agenda isn't wrong and it's actually vital for a democracy. We think that even if because even if the state is actually lying, they can these people can vote it out of their office because at the end of the day, it's a democratic nation. But thirdly, we tell you that they have offered no analysis and no impact. So we think that their whole idea about this, that the state will alter the truth based on one example, is not enough. Now let me move on with our arguments in today's debate. Firstly, I'm going to argue, no thank you, that the urgency of state-owned media, but secondly, the justifications, and thirdly, my sixth speaker will tell you why we can give better outcome for these nations. Now we move on to my first argument, which is
sir.
I'm going to prove to you, no thank you, I'm going to prove to you one thing in this argument, that there is a lack of truth that is being exploited. So to the first point, basically we have two stakeholders in this point. Firstly, social media websites, but secondly, the private media. So firstly, in social media websites, no thank you, I'll take you in a minute. So about social media, we think that free speech is actually good. It's actually vital for social media, but people are genuinely spreading false information in the social media, are marking propaganda for certain issues. Well, for example, in COVID-19 in Canada, people were encountering posts on Facebook telling them that they shouldn't wear masks, etc. And the impact of this is false information. Look, panel, we understand that there is a problem lying in the people awareness and stuff, and that there is a lack of guaranteed info. But we think that they should turn to the state, which has the health ministry, which is more reliable than Facebook posts, and then, or even than private. So before I move on to the second stakeholders are taking point.
So how would people vote a person out of office if they don't know that the truth is being faked and altered?
Actually, that's the point, because there are private companies and there are private media organizations. If the private media organizations make sense more than the state-owned companies, then these people will make sense out of it and place their lodging in the first place, and they would vote the state, they would vote the head of government out of office in the next elections. That this is a democratic nation, of course. But second, stakeholders that are private media. What is happening in these private media institutions? We think that many of these private media institutions are actually maybe good, maybe genuine, but there is a problem in practicing free speech. And that is to say, they are being, the information that is being spread, they're exploiting it to prove political agenda, which is actually genuinely what proposition tries to push on us, that the state will do so. Well, actually, media organizations that are private are proving that maybe are proving the opposition to the state, or saying that they're pushing their political agenda. But why is this harmful? Look, in 2014, the CNN saying that black man was killed by a white man spread a lot of hate speech against white men, against white people. We think that at the end of the day, this man was actually not killed, and he died only of a heart attack. But because CNN was pushing a political agenda, we thought that the people had no other choice and had no other alternative. And that is why state-owned media in this place would have said, well, he only died of heartbreak. No, thank you. He only died of a heartbreak, and that there is no need to panic and place hate speech in the first place. So the impact of this is that there is a lack of truth, which is being exploited by private media or by social media in the first place. So now moving on to my second argument, which I'm going to place here in this justification of state-owned media. I'm going to prove two things in this argument. Firstly, that states have an access to more reliable info, but secondly, understanding the state better for the people. So first point, that states have access to more reliable information. Basically, states can actually access companies, can access private entities or entities overseas where the private media cannot access. What does this look like? This looks like documentaries being placed in countries like China, countries like Russia, no thank you, that the access is very exclusive to these state-owned media. This looks like PBS, the Canadian state-owned media, doing a program called Frontline, which actually rallied a lot of support from the people because it has a lot of courage to go to these nations, because they have access to talk to people like Putin, to talk to people like a prime minister of Malaysia, for example. We think that if they can meet foreign personnel, if these state-owned media can meet these people, then they can have access, they can place a more broad documentaries. Now moving on to the second point. Now, the second point, I'll talk to you about the understanding of thank you, understanding the state better, time out. Understanding the state better, basically because the state has an opinion. We tell you when the state has an opinion, it needs to be shared. Now, you might ask, why is it the media exclusive to be shared, that the state of opinion to be shared in the media? We tell you because when you actually hear real info daily from the state in state-owned media, unlike normal interviews, maybe with the head of state, maybe with Donald Trump, we tell you, I as a citizen will be more likely to understand and know someone point of view if that someone told their opinion when informing a piece of information. And that is why you can know the opinion of companies, of media organizations like Fox News or like CNN, because they are placing information to you. Now look, you might actually say that they will push political agenda as state-owned media. And this is not wrong, because they have an opinion and this is the political agenda, they would push it. It's okay. If this political agenda is harmful, as I said before, they can vote it out of office. Now, because we understand that the state had access for documentaries, for real broad information, and because we can understand the state better in our approach, we tell you to oppose.
Thank you, Mr. Ibrahim. It was nice hearing you give your speech. We are now moving to the MNDT's second speaker. Could you please turn on your camera? Thank you, Alia. So you have 8 minutes speaking time, starting in 3, 2, 1.
So what the opposition's case in this debate rests on primarily is the villainization of private media organization and the false characterization of the state. So first I'd like to acknowledge what the opposition has said, and I'd like to acknowledge his argumentation. So the first thing that the opposition speaker has said is that the truth is lacking because of the propaganda pushed by private businesses. Throughout his entire speech, the opposition speaker has talked about how private ownership of media organizations consistently pushes a false propaganda and consistently lies to its people. However, this is a complete false characterization of what is actually happening, because private organizations and private businesses that are not state-owned and that are not funded by any political parties or by any government parties have no incentive to push a political agenda. On the contrary, it is the state that has an incentive to push its political agenda, and for example, if the state is primarily, let's say in the United States, Republican, which is the case, it would push a Republican rhetoric over its people. It's not the private media organizations that do so, but it is media outlets like CNN and Fox News that are funded by the government and funded by political parties. I'd also like to acknowledge the fact that the opposition speaker has talked about how how the state has an opinion, and that by allowing the state to control media organizations, that information needs to be shared. However, this is simply contradicting the idea of freedom of speech, because it is saying that some people's, in this case the state's opinions, are supposed to be prioritized over others, like private media organizations and people who decide to share their opinions. And this is simply contradicting the very idea of freedom of speech, which says that it allows everyone to speak their opinions and to be heard. So the opposition in general has said that, has also pointed out that our side hasn't provided any burdens. However, I would like to say that we have provided plenty of burdens. The two major burdens that we'll be speaking about today is that, first, we'll prove to you that truth is lacking because of the propaganda pushed by the state, and that private ownership of media organizations is a better alternative. So first, I'd like to discuss my first argument, which is enabling media organizations' private ownership pushes the values of a democratic state. So government-owned media organizations contradict a democratic state's founding principles, which is the freedom of the press. The freedom of the press entails the right of newspapers, magazines to report news without being controlled by the government. And that democratic states owning media, no thank you, owning media, no, thank you. Media ownership counters its founding principles. By controlling media organization, democratic states are veering towards communist and fascist states, which push propaganda and censorship. Examples include, for example, China, no, thank you, has blocked thousands of internet sites, including Facebook, Gmail, Google, Instagram, and even Pinterest. New websites such as English and Chinese, no, thank you, and BBC, the New York Times, Bloomberg, and others. So even with some very few of these followers, they have been blocking out information to be accessed to the people. My second argument rests on the case that instead of the government using money to funding famous newspapers, the government could use this money to fund other important facilities such as healthcare. A recent study from 2 years ago found that in over 355 countries worldwide, the government used state funding to manipulate media. In 9 out of 10, there was no evidence showing that. Yes, go ahead.
Actually, you're mischaracterizing the motion. In Australia, there is state-owned media, and it does not look like China. There are numbers of state-owned media, and there is no authoritarianism or any type of attack in journalism.
Well, see, the thing is that you're taking an isolated case, which is Australia, and you're using it as an example to justify all state-owned media and all state-owned organizations. And that's false. You are falsely characterizing what is the reality, which is when a state, a democratic state, owns private media organizations, it is fundamentally contradicting the idea of a democratic state, which is freedom of press. Freedom of the press is the founding principle, and when states decide to own media organizations, they are contradicting this founding principle. So I'd like to continue with my arguments. So I was discussing how examples ranging from Eastern Europe, Argentina, Colombia, Peru, Guatemala, Nicaragua in Central America, Indonesia, Malaysia, and even South Africa are using their government funding, their state funding, to manipulate important private ownership businesses and to manipulate the public into believing political agenda. So to go back to what my partner has said, what the first proposition speaker has said, our first argument was that allowing democratic states to own media can possibly push an agenda. And the most famous example of this is that when the government harmfully altered the media's purpose during the 2016 US presidential debate. And this is a direct response to the opposition speaker's claim that the state will not manipulate information and will not spread false lies because it does not want to, does not want to be caught, and it doesn't want its chances to be elected to be jeopardized. However, we have seen that in the 2016 US presidential debate, multiple accounts were created that pushed a specific rhetoric that favored the Republican Party. Examples include the Russian agents, which is a government, intended to sow among American citizens, no thank you, disseminating inflammatory posts that reached 126 million users on Facebook, publishing more than 131,000 messages on Twitter, and uploading over 1,000 videos to Google's YouTube services, pushing a Republican rhetoric. Social media platforms inherently give far-right parties and authoritarian politicians an advantage because they give way to the techniques such as fear-mongering and turning people against minority groups, spreading fake news, and planting suspicion in people's minds guidelines towards independent media outlets. So this is a clear example of when the state has decided to interfere in elections using the media, using the state-controlled media to push a rhetoric, a harmful rhetoric on its own people. So what is the social outcome, since the opposition has attacked us on the fact that we haven't given a analysis, although we have given a very sophisticated analysis? I'll give you an analysis. The social outcome of this is that allowing democratic states to own private media normalizes the interference with truth and manipulates the public into believing that false information restricts them from accessing the story. This provides the government the power to lie to its citizens and weaponize media to their advantage. It's forcing mainstream media to manufacture a narrative rather than report the news, because private media ownership businesses do not have an incentive to push a political agenda, while the state does. So in the second argument that my partner said, he discussed how media organizations owned by democratic states could jeopardize important news becoming accessible to everyone. And this was an argument that was completely ignored by the opposition. The opposition did not discuss our intricate analysis about how allowing the state to own private businesses, to own private media ownership, could primarily allow them to target black zip codes, and primarily black zip codes, and people over others. So in conclusion, what we have showed you is that, first of all, enabling media organizations pushes the values of a democratic state, and that allowing democratic states to own media can possibly push a political agenda, which has been completely falsely characterized by the other side. So for this reason, I proudly stand for proposition.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Adia, for your speech. So time is up. We are now moving to the second speaker from Team Opposition. Could you please turn on your camera? Okay. Hello. Thank you, Alma. So we are going to be proceeding in 3, 2.
So is my voice?
I'm sorry.
Oh, just a second. I just need to set my timer right here. So I just need to set my timer. So yes, we can proceed. And okay, so your time or my time? Okay, we'll proceed in 3, 2, 1. Democracy, freedom and speech, and people's right to know. Judge, we can't see how proposition can support these things while simultaneously oppressing one side, which is the state, from actually voicing their own point of view. So what will I be doing in today's debate? First of all, several pieces of rebuttal, and then I'll be moving on towards my argument. First of all, side proposition started by talking about how private parties have no incentive to push a political agenda. However, we tell you that that is completely false. Private parties, even if they are not state-owned, many private parties do have the incentive to push a political agenda. Just because they aren't owned by the state, and just because they are owned by a certain person, doesn't mean this person does not have the incentive to push a political agenda. We give you the example of in Lebanon, many private channels do actually push their own political incentives, even if those channels are not related to politics or by a certain political party. But they do push their own political they do in the end going to push their own political agenda. We give you the example of the Daily Show from the United States, which pushes the left wing's point of view. Even though if it is not state-owned, it does push a leftist point of view. So it is completely false to say that private parties have no incentive to push a political agenda. And second of all, they kept on saying about how allowing the state to own a form of media leads to a prioritization to this form of media over others, and how it will jeopardize the other points of views, and that the truth will then be lacking. However, we tell you, just because the state owns one or two or more several forms of media, we are not censoring private sources of media, nor are we stopping them. We are allowing them to be viewed. However, we are also allowing the state to give their own form of media. So there is no need for it to be prioritized, because people can still view what they choose to view, If for example I want to view this CNN or Fox News, I can switch the channel to whatever I want. There is no need for it to be prioritized over anything. So this characterization is completely false on their side to say that it will be prioritized. And by the point to saying that the truth will be lacking, however, we tell you this is most likely to happen on their side of the house because they are the ones who are actually erasing a whole narrative. They are the ones who are erasing the state's narrative and only allowing no thank you, and only allowing other sides to show their narratives. They are the ones with only one-sided narrative. And then they started talking about how the government might actually weaponize the media. However, we tell you that any one party that owns media is likely to weaponize it for its own uses. So we are just giving them the right to voice we are giving them the platform to voice their opinions to the public. And any one party that does have a media is going to actually use this media to voice to voice it and to voice their views into the public. And so before I move on, I'll take your point.
How are the private media organizations that you cited not politicized if they push a certain political narrative?
Okay, we are not saying that we won't allow any politicized party to own media. We are saying that we won't allow the state to own media. We are not saying that any politicized party won't be allowed to own media. That is completely false. That is completely false on your side of the house. So moving on to my argument, which is going to be about the effectiveness, the effectiveness of allowing the state in minimizing bias and minimizing propaganda. So my first speaker told you about how every form of media is in the end going to be subjected to bias and propaganda based on the owner of the media. So every form of media, not only news, even movies, are a tool for the owner to express their opinion and their views. We believe the state should be allowed to own media because if private-owned media is the only form of media if the people can consume, they are in the end being subjected to bias and propaganda because they can't see all sides of the story. They are only being subjected to one narrative, which is the narrative of the private state media. So notice, Judge, we aren't stopping them. We aren't censoring them. We aren't stopping any form of media against the government. We are allowing everybody to express their views at the end of the day. But isn't the state supposed to be one of the parties allowed to express their views and allowed to express their side? So why is it important and effective in limiting propaganda for the government to own media? Because first of all, the government's aim is maintaining peace and security in the nation. It is in the end a democracy, so it's less likely to risk its reputation or its position. It is less likely to spread false information and be biased. No, thank you. So the example that their second speaker said, the example that they said was only one example. It was only one example. Well, it's a lot more likely on their side of the house. So even if the state decides, no, thank you. Even if the state decides to spread biased information, then the private parties can still spread their side of the story. So the people can still have more than one side, and the people can choose which side they choose to. Protects the nation against false information. So if people were to be biased and spread, no, thank you. If people were to be biased and spread lies against the government from outside and to plot against the government would then have a platform to protect themselves. For example, there was a lot of fake news going against the Syrian government. No, thank you. Against the Syrian government and how it was using chemical weapons against its own citizens from the outside. If the government did not have its own form of media to negate this information would have stuck with the people, and they would have believed it. No, thank you. I'm not taking any more points. And then, for example, after the spread of the false information about the dollar in Syria, many private owned media started saying that the price of the dollar was changing, even though it wasn't. Many merchants started changing their own money into in the form. The government-owned media was the only exist. The people would have no way of knowing what the actual price of the dollar was. My fourth point is that the states will have the best resources and most accurate news, thus people will be hearing the news that must be heard. Why is this true? Because on other private channels, the source of news can easily be based on rumors or biased opinions, while state-owned media gets their information directly from the source. For example, information about diplomacy and outside relations is more likely to be secure from directly from government-owned media. No, thank you. So what is as well as the spread of unreliable information during elections can severely affect the voters' choice, and that is why we think that the state should have its own platform to spread information. In the end, the people will then have the right to choose whether they want to believe the state-owned media or the private-owned media, but they will have more than one form of media to believe. So what is the impact of my point? The impact of all of my point is that the government should have a voice and the platform to voice its own views to the people. Fake news, this should be against fake news against the government, and news that aims to spread chaos in a certain country, as well as that it provides information straight from the source of news. So, Judge, if you support people being informed from more than one side, and if you support the people having the right to choose of where they want to get their information from and not being limited to one narrative, we think that in today's debate you should vote opposition, and thank you.
Thank you, Amma. You have reached your time. Thank you very much. We are now moving back to team proposition with the.
I'm just gonna set my timer. 1 minute.
That's totally cool. So you let us know when you're ready, please.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna start. 1, 2, 3. Good evening, distinguished guests. The topic for our debate is that this House believes that democratic states should not own or run media organizations. And we, the proposition team, believe that this statement is true, and democratic states should stay away from running social media, while presenting multiple arguments and examples to support our position. So to start off, I want to clarify something, is that a speaker from the opposition team said in a POI that you don't want to remove all of them. But we think that we should stop these news that are run by these democratic states, because, I mean, why would we leave them? If something is harmful, we should remove it, because their job, I mean, the normal media's job is to report raw news and truths without their opinions, which is not what they do, because they are always supporting the government and the governments. And so, but the private-owned news have very objective news, because they are not controlled by anyone. They are not pushed by anyone. Therefore, their articles are unbiased more than the others, because they have no interest in pushing an agenda or defending someone. So firstly, I want to go over some arguments presented by our opponents. So the first speaker from the opposition team stated during his speech that what's wrong with political agendas and defended CNN. But yet these same agendas supported and encouraged hate toward a minority group. And you are attacking private-owned medias, but logically, these ones are much more reasonable and unbiased, because they don't have to obey anyone, because they are free to say whatever they want. They are not trapped inside a cage, and they can't say whatever they want. In contrast, the medias run by governments cannot go up against the government, so they always defend them. Therefore, they are biased, so we should remove them, because they are not doing their job, which is reporting the real news and raw truths. Yes?
Okay.
Yes?
What guarantees that private-owned media won't be biased?
Okay. So what guarantees you that the medias that are run by governments won't be unbiased? What guarantees this? Nothing. But we are saying that it's much more logical to think that these private-owned medias will be more unbiased in their news reports. So the second speaker from the opposition team also tried to tell that the private-owned medias can also push certain agendas. But here is your answer. It is much less likely, because we are sure that government-run medias are biased and push certain agendas, because that's how it is. We are sure 100% about it. but it's much more less likely to happen in private-owned medias because, you know, you cannot be sure that all of these private-owned news are one-sided. You cannot, because it depends on each one and on each owner, and each owner has its own goals. As of the other news, we are sure that they are one-sided, and you are claiming that all of these private-owned medias are biased, and you cannot judge all of them because different owners have different goals. There are some people that are unbiased. No, there are some people that are unbiased, which you are unfortunately not recognizing. Just because there are some of them that push these agendas and that are biased, it does not mean we should generalize and ignore the unbiased private-owned media outlets that give raw information. But the government-run news are certainly biased. And the second speaker said that they get their information directly from the government, which means that they are much more likely to be true. But it doesn't work that way because they get information directly from the government. Then they are
your second speaker actually mentioned that these, like CNN, are funded by party, i.e. are funded by the state.
These same media outlets are pushing a lot of agenda, and has been proven time after time that they are unbiased. So why should we defend them? Why should we keep something? Because I know that if something is harmful to you, if something doesn't give you what it should, you should remove it, and we all think so. Because if something is not true, it shouldn't stay available. It's not fair to us as citizens to see all these fake news in our social media, because there are a lot of social media outlets that are run by governments, and they want to make us believe whatever they want, and they want us to believe that the government is really positive. So which means that we prefer having private-owned social media outlets rather than a government-run one. Now I'm going to go over the arguments presented by my team, the proposition team. Our first speaker spoke to you about how social media would affect the outcome of the results and falsify them. And I support this argument because it is completely logical. In social media, the more followers you have, the stronger your voice is. So the news presented by these social media outlets that are run by governments overpowers others, which basically leads to it falsifying the real outcomes and hiding the real raw truths that we as citizens are looking for, which goes against what democracy really is. So social media has been criticized as being detrimental to democracy, which proves again our point that democracy states should not own nor run social media, so we can receive the real actual news instead of misinformation and biased truths. The first speaker also stated during his speech the point about freedom of press. So in a democratic country, people should have the freedom in many things, like giving real news and giving their own opinions without worrying about the government. And because they cannot do so, they are not free to say whatever they want. Why? Because they are controlled and run by the government, so they are not allowed to go up against them. And we have given you a strong example because actually Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg announced Facebook's new policy to allow politicians the right to post false information. How is this good for us? How is this fair for us? We are defending the people that are fooled by these false news and are being blinded by everything. It is not fair to us because we are seeing false news everywhere, biased news everywhere. We do not want this. We want real news that are being reported, and that will be reported by private-owned media outlets. As of the second speaker, she mentioned how allowing private ownership for social media outlets would be more objective, therefore better for democratic states, because that way they are free to report any news without any misinformation and without them being unbiased, which is good for democratic states, which is valid and important to this debate, because we are looking for media that will be unbiased and give the real news. Instead of defending the government, time's up. Instead of defending the government, even if they are wrong. The second speaker also gave examples to support the position. She stated that some experts have gone so far as to say that social media platforms are putting democracy in danger, which supports our position. She also said that we could probably use the money that government is using to fund these media outlets. They should rather be used in valuable resources such as schools, healthcare. We need to use that money wisely for other organizations that will serve us and benefit us. So ladies and gentlemen, Team Morocco believes that we should not keep all of these unbiased social media outlets that are ran by the government. And this is why I proudly stand for our position and for team proposition, because we want what's best for the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Basma from team proposition at the MNDT. We now welcome the third speaker, Yasmin. Yasmin from the team opposition. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm going to set up my timer, and I prefer if I begin myself without anyone timing me, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course, definitely.
Okay, thank you. Am I audible?
When you're ready.
Because sometimes, okay. So many things inside proposition are not understandable. First, why the people cannot have the right of them to choose what media they're going to watch, whether they are going to watch BBC News or whether they're going to watch The Atlantic, for example. The second thing we don't understand is how is the mechanisms of these news. How are we going to remove these news? How are governments going to let down their media that they own currently? And thirdly, the criteria of these news and how do they work and how they're going to be on later on in the future or in a few years. We also don't understand that their whole case works in a vacuum. Like, firstly, they give us no examples as to in their framework as to how journalists face attacks, in particularly in democratic countries and not in other countries authoritarian like Russia or China, for example. Secondly, we don't understand how governments, democratic governments, are associated with freeless press. We don't understand how this happens. The only thing they tell us, and their only responses to our side of the house, which they never engaged fully, was that they are biased, they have the incentive. However, we tell you that we don't understand why it happens in both sides of the house, and we don't understand why they are so exclusive that they have to win today's debate. So what am I going to do? Firstly, I'm going to reply to 2 points on the last speaker, and secondly, I'm going to answer 2 main questions that happened in today's debate. So firstly, the other side, the new thing that their last speaker brought up was that private sectors depend on their owners, therefore they have different ideologies. However, we don't understand how this doesn't mean that they will also be biased. How if they have all different owners, that means that they won't have different ideologies or political benefits. I won't be taking any POIs at the moment. But secondly, so because they have their own goals, as the other side of the house says, that means that they are likely to make something biased as well. However, we tell you that this is not exclusive to their side of the house. We tell you that this is happening both sides of the house. However, we are trying to make it less in our side of the house but no, thank you. The last point that they also brought up was that they repeated so much is that the press is going to be chased by the government, or that because they're run by the government. However, we tell you that this is a big mischaracterization. Why is this? Firstly, because if they run a private sector, or if people in the government or journalists talk something from their own perspective, that doesn't mean that they're going to be chased by the government. No, thank you. I won't be taking POIs at the moment. Secondly, we tell you that because these people live in democratic countries, that means that they won't be chased by the government. So on to our first question: how does a democracy look like? So onto their perspective, they look like democracy is chosen by the people. Secondly, that they should have freedom of speech and freedom of press. Secondly, that journalists in these countries face attacks. However, we don't understand. No, thank you. How do they face attacks? Since they are in democratic countries where people, if they are doing something wrong, where the state, if it does something wrong, people can simply vote for re-elections, for example, or make other people throw them out, or for example, make them bring up a lawsuit. And secondly, because democracy is chosen by the people, that means that they are voicing out the opinions of the people, which means if we oppress the freedom of these press, it means that we are oppressing a vast majority of society. It means that we are making a lot of people in this society not have their voices out, just like a minority, or for example, other people that do not that are not with the government. We don't understand why should private sectors be completely objective. They also tell us the idea of that they have the incentive and they have their own interest. However, we tell you why is this exclusive and not also to private sectors. We secondly tell you that they can be thrown out. No, thank you. And thirdly, we tell you that we do not understand why the other side of the house thinks that people are so foolish that they cannot, like for example, go to other news or see for themselves the facts and truth that are happening in the world, why people should be manipulated in any way by some people that are talking something that they do not believe in the first place, because there are so many news that are already, like for in our side of the house we have private sector and we have public sector. That means that people can run into any one of them, and like it's life and anything can be biased, and that's something that happens in any side of the world and in any debate. So we don't think it's actually something that is all exclusive to our side of the house. But before I move on to our second question, yes please.
So you said in the beginning of your speech, how are we going to do it? But we proposed in our speech that the government will use that money for other resources like schools and healthcare, and these news outlets that will be unbiased and will give us the real truths will get money from ad revenue, sponsors, and subscriptions. So this solves the problems that you stated in the beginning of your speech.
Okay, so basically, either you're going to remove money from some services, like for example, from children's education, or second, and you're making a world really bad, or secondly, you're actually making more state-run press, and that's actually something that you don't want in your side of the house. So I don't think that you're making actually something preferable or better in your side of the house. So on to our second question, what would change in both sides of the house? So firstly, they never tell us what are the characteristics of this news, how would they look like. So on the idea of news, they tell us that that governments are going to alter the news, that they are going to spread manipulation, misinformation, sorry, and that they are going to manipulate other people. They gave us the example of Trump. However, we tell you that the example of Trump is actually a Republican, like the first speaker just said. And secondly, we tell you that this is not likely to be the truth. Like when you said that they were associating with the Russian government, which is not democratic. This means that Trump is actually a corrupt. That doesn't mean that BBC News, for example, that is also a state-run news, should also be corrupt, like Trump, for example. Or if or in Canadian news should also be should be altering the truth. We also tell you that we don't understand what kind of news they should be altering. Is it for the good of the people? We tell you that these countries have less incentive because they do not have crisis, for example, and they do not have something to hide from the public. For example, India, in the democratic country of India, there's actually a developing country, and even in developing countries, they have transparency because that's how they are, because they want the people know what's happening in the world and in their own country, because they want the best for their own people, and they want the best for their own economy, because they know that when the society is good, it means that other people are also good, out of order.
Ma'am?
We also know out of order. We also tell you that the example of Facebook and how it's jeopardizing accessibility is completely false. Firstly, they never tell us how this is going to happen. And secondly, we tell you that social media like Facebook or something is not actually reliable anyways, even if Mark Zuckerberg puts a new policy or whatever. Because of these reasons, because we tell you how the fundamentals of democracy, because we tell you what changes in our side of the house, and because we're much better, I'm so proud to oppose.
Thank you, Ms. Yasmin, for your speech.
Thank you.
Although you may have gone a little bit over time, but thank you for your speech anyway. We're now moving to Mr. Ibrahim Al-Qasir. You could go whenever you're ready.
Sure, that's no problem. Let me set my timer. It's right here.
It's gonna be 4 minutes.
Yep. My speech starts in 3, 2, 1. From the beginning of today's debate, we thought that there was a mischaracterization that their side of the house pushed the Chinese example on us. things like attacking journalists, and etc. Now, we told you that the state-owned journalism is actually evident in democratic countries like Australia and Canada. And this is actually the reality in the status quo that we ought to engage with. And then they tell us that we are isolating cases and examples. Now, actually, their side of the house had less logic than examples. And we thought that this is problematic for two reasons. Firstly, this is an impromptu debate, which I've probably prepared before. But secondly, this debate is not about examples. What they have said themselves that we shouldn't isolate cases and we shouldn't care about examples. So I think there was a mischaracterization from their side of the house. I'm going to compare proposition wall and opposition wall, and hopefully I will not be interrupted by the POIs, especially we have been interrupted a lot. Now, in opposition, we told you that private media exploits and pushes political agenda, like CNN, when it pushed a political agenda regarding a black man being killed, which he was not killed by a white man. In fact, he was dead naturally. On proposition, they tell us that they are funded by the state, that they represent the party, but then they tell us the same example that CNN is not biased and that CNN does not push political agenda, and that even though they are controlled by the state, they mischaracterize that. But also in opposition, we told you that we are not owning all private media companies. We're just establishing maybe one or two media companies, maybe one or two media organizations, and we still support free media, free speech, and free media and freedom of expression. On their side of the house, and they tell us that the state will alter the truth and things that we thought as extreme, and that actually they will not do that, because if the people don't like it, they will vote the office out in the next re-election. So we thought that even pushing political agenda might not happen, because if this political agenda will be harmful, there's a high risk and high things at stake for the state themselves. They would risk re-elections, and that was a valid analysis which was not refuted. We also gave you an opposition and justification for this whole thing. And we told you that firstly, the state has access to reliable info, which we drawn on and extended in our second speech by Alma. We told you that this state would have more reliable info when it talks to foreign personnel. And secondly, we told you the second justification is that they would understand the state, that people would understand the state better. On proposition, they had literally no response to these 2 points, which we thought stood valid in today's debate. But also on proposition, they tell us that private isn't biased and that private is the best, that things that have ever been created, and that they support free speech. Actually, in opposition, we told you a very strict example that these types of private media, they represent individuals, and individuals' ideas might not be democratic at many times, might even incentivize more hate speech. I don't see why they would. We don't see that why the proposition would say that these individuals have unbiased views. But also on opposition, we told you that false information spread on social media and false health, especially false health information on social media. We said that the state is the most reliable because it has the health minister. They had no response on the social media example. But also on proposition, they tell us that we are not stopping politicization. Panel, we want to clear something out, even though we did, that we are not saying that we will clear politicization. We're just saying that politicization is a problem when they have no alternative from the state. Because we think that when you push as many narratives as you can, the people in the state themselves will be able to make more debates and make more rationale from themselves. So take this analogy. In proposition, they talk about free speech while preventing the state from owning companies that can advocate for their speech. But on opposition, we allow all narrative to be presented. That's why opposition wins.
Thank you, Mr. Ibrahim, for your speech. We're now moving to Morocco with the Miss Alia. Miss Ali, you let us know whenever you're ready.
Yep. So 1, 2, 3. So Team Syria has been remarkably uncomparative and unnuanced in today's debate. They first began by claiming that they support the state ownership of some media outlets and not all, when the motion clearly implies that democratic states should not run media organizations and not cherry pick them. They have attempted to create a world that satisfies both sides, but have failed to accomplish this task on both fronts. What I'll be doing today in this final speech is responding to the opposition's argumentation, then re-emphasizing our points and clearly outlining why we have won this debate. So first, let me respond to their argumentation. So the opposition has continued to play on this idea that private media organizations push propaganda. Now we'll respond in this with 3 responses. First, we have clearly stated time and time again that private media organizations have no incentive to spread falsehood unless they are funded by government political parties, which is very often the case. The opposition has attempted to characterize the press as a villainous entity that pushes political agendas, when the reality is that state-owned media organizations are the ones doing that. The opposition claims that private-owned media only shows one facet of the truth. Why would this not be the case for the state? The opposition again and again has failed to prove why the state would not push political agendas. They have provided a bland analysis and empty promises. Finally, the state control over media does not allow people to practice democracy when they are steered towards the state's POV rather than their own. In fact, media will become biased by a forceful state. The second argumentation, the major argumentation that they have made, is that any form of media will be subject to propaganda and that therefore the state should be allowed to use that media. Well, does that mean that Team Syria is condoning the weaponization of the media simply because the state is doing it? Does that mean that it becomes okay for falsehoods to be spread, manipulation to run rampant, and mediaized oppression to be allowed simply because the state is the one doing it? Well, now let's go back to our house's argumentation. In the beginning of this debate, we have stated the following burdens: that first, media organizations owned by democratic states are harmful to society, and that second, private ownership of media organizations is a better alternative. So we have also provided a detailed nuance mechanism, which has been totally ignored by the opposition. We have given a clear, nuanced characterization of what our world looks like, but the opposition conveniently avoided it. We stated in this beginning of this debate that the media organizations should be privately owned, and that a plethora of famous newspapers such as the New York Times use a subscription system where users would have to pay a monthly fee to have access to all of the newspaper's content, and that if the subscription is not an option, many other famous newspapers would add revenue to fund themselves, that therefore people would be able to have access to news content freely. So clearly I've provided a reasonable solution as to how our world would look like and how these private businesses would continue to work without the funding from the government and without being owned by the state. So let me remind you, Judge, of the arguments we have outlined in this debate. Our first argument was that allowing democratic states to own media can possibly push a political agenda, and we have provided a reasonable analysis as to why that is the case. Our second argument was that media organizations owned by democratic states could jeopardize important news becoming accessible to everyone. Our third stated that enabling media organizations' private ownership pushes the values of a democratic state. And finally, that instead of the government using money to fund famous newspapers, the government could use this money to fund other important facilities such as healthcare and education. It is fair to say that our House has clearly answered our burdens, outlined an effective mechanism, and overall provided a real democratic solution to the harmful status quo that is being perpetuated by the opposition. And that is why today I proudly stand for proposition. Thank you.